So today is the 1st of October 2023, and I was thinking maybe I should do another of those collective readings for the collective, as I haven't done one of those in ages. I sort of thought, who reads books anymore? What is there to learn from a book? But then I thought, maybe I'm just rotting my brain from constantly looking at Zero Hedge. It would be good to read some long form writing rather than download the latest information. This little mat is the back cover to the Santana album Borboleto, Portuguese for butterfly. If you're wondering what else is in my record collection, it's basically all Stones and Santana, because anytime you look in a second-hand record shop, you'll always find another Santana album you haven't heard. Now, I hope you appreciate how awkward it is trying to have a book on camera. Obviously, it would be much easier just to appear on camera, like sitting in a nice lounge or reading from the book. But I'm waiting till I hit about 1 million subscribers to do that. Hopefully, I can take over from Russell Brand on behalf of Tavistock at that point. Anyway, for the last year, or I don't know, 2 years, who knows where the time goes, I've been trying to read this book, The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, which was written in the 1930s to the 40s, and it's set in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1913, just before the beginning of World War I. And it's one of those old books which is remarkable in feeling like it could have been written yesterday, or even that it's all a metaphor for the times we're living in. It's just a good reminder when we get caught up in the magical theater of the absurd being projected all around us, that we think we're living in such unique times. It's always good to read an old book and see that the more things change, the more they stay the same, as you could easily imagine yourself living in these times. As I said before, all that's really changed is the surveillance technology. But people are the same. He describes the same situations, the same interaction of the mass media, the ideologies of the day, and how the midwits infest and ruin everything. It's really a fascinating book, and one of the terms that's used throughout the book is pseudo-reality, which I find very interesting. It's like a minor synchronicity, as it's a term I've often heard John Waters use over the last couple of years. And obviously, when I refer to John Waters, I'm referring to the Irish writer, intellectual, and ex-journalist. I'd like to know where that term originated for John, aka Mr. Waters, because pseudo-reality surely describes what we're dealing with now. So there's a reality of the mainstream media and politics and the military-industrial complex, and then there's the day-to-day reality we live within, trying to leave the cave every day. So it's interesting, as I was trying to read this book over the last couple of years, and I still haven't finished it, I have to admit. Don't tell me the ending. It's interesting to see this term synchronize with what we observe now. So here's a short chapter, which I think is quite apt for the collective for October 2023. Chapter 83 of The Man Without Qualities. Pseudo-reality prevails, or why don't we make history up as we go along? What could Ulrich have said to Clarice anyway? He had kept it to himself because she had somehow brought him more or less. God does not really mean the world literally. It is a metaphor, an analogy, a figure of speech that he has to resort to for some reason or other. And it never satisfies him, of course. We are not supposed to take him at his word. It is we ourselves who must come up with the answer for the riddle he sets us. He wondered whether Clarice would have agreed to regard the whole thing as a game of cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers. Of course, she would. Whoever took the first step, she would stick by him like a she-wolf and keep a sharp lookout. But there was something else he had also had on the tip of his tongue, something about mathematical problems that do not admit of a general solution, but do allow for particular solutions which one could combine to come nearer to a general solution. He might have added that he regarded the problem of human life as that kind of problem, what we call an age, without specifying whether we mean centuries, millennia, or the time span between school child and grandparent. That broad, unregulated flow of conditions would come to mean a more or less chaotic succession of unsatisfactory and in themselves false answers, out of which there might emerge the right and whole solution only when mankind had learned to put all the pieces together. On his way home in the streetcar, it all came back to him, but he was rather ashamed of such thoughts in the presence of the other passengers riding into town with him. One could tell by looking at them that they were on their way home from definite occupations or setting out toward definite entertainments. Even just by looking at their clothes, one could tell where they had come from or were going. He studied the woman next to him, clearly a wife and mother, 40-ish, probably the wife of an academic, and she had small opera glasses on her lap. Sitting beside her, toying with these ideas, he felt like a little boy at play and playing something slightly improper at that. For to think without perusing some practical purpose is surely an improper, furtive occupation, especially those thoughts that take huge strides on stilts, touching experience only with tiny souls. I was interrupted there. Let's read that again. For to think without perusing some practical purpose is surely an improper, furtive occupation, especially those thoughts to take huge strides on stilts, touching experience only with tiny souls, are automatically suspect of having disreputable origins. There was a time when people talked of their thoughts taking wing. In Schiller's time, such intellectual high flyers would have been widely esteemed, but our own day, such a person seems to have something the matter with him, unless it happens to be his profession and source of income. There has obviously been a shift in our priorities. Certain concerns have been taken out of people's hearts for high-flown theology or literature. I have to do that again. For high-flown thoughts, a kind of poultry farm has been set up called philosophy, theology, or literature, where they proliferate in their own way beyond anyone's ability to keep track of them, which is just as well. Because in the face of such expansion, no one need feel guilty about not bothering with them personally. With his respect for professionalism and expertise, Ulrich was basically determined to go along with any such a division of labour. Nevertheless, he still indulged in thinking for himself, even though he was no professional philosopher, and at the moment he could see that to do otherwise was to take the road leading to the beehive state. The queen would lay her eggs, the drones would devote themselves to lust and the life of the mind, and the specialists would toil. It was quite possible to imagine the world so organized. Total productivity might even go up as a result. For the present, every human being is still a microcosm of all humanity, as it were. But this has clearly become too much to bear, and it no longer works, so that the humane element has become a transparent fraud. For the new division of labour to succeed, it might be necessary to arrange for at least one set of workers to evolve an intellectual synthesis. After all, without mind, what Ulrich meant was that it would give him nothing to look forward to. But this was, of course, a prejudice. No one really knows what life depends on. He shifted in his seat and studied the reflection of his face in the window pane opposite, looking for something else to think about. But there was his head floating along in the fluid glass, midway between the inside and the outside, becoming remarkably compelling after a while in its insistence on some kind of completion. Was there a war actually going on in the Balkans or not? Some sort of intervention was undoubtedly going on, but whether it was war was hard to tell. So much was astir in the world. There was another new record for high-altitude flight, something to be proud of. If he was not mistaken, the record now stood at 3,700 meters, and the man's name was Joho. A black boxer had beaten the white champion. The new holder of the world title was Johnson. The president of France was going to Russia. There was talk of world peace being at stake. A newly discovered tenor was garnering fees in South America that had never been equaled even in North America. A terrible earthquake had devastated Japan. The poor Japanese. In short, much was happening. There was great excitement everywhere around the turn of 1913 and 1914. But 2 years or 5 years earlier, there had also been much excitement. Every day had its sensations, and yet it was hard, not to say impossible, to remember what it was that had actually happened. A possible synopsis. The new cure for syphilis was making. Research into plant metabolism was moving. The conquest of the South Pole seemed. Professor Steinach's experiments with monkey glands were arousing. Half the details could easily be left out without making much difference. What a strange business history was. We could safely say of this or that event that it had already found its place in history, or certainly would find it, but whatever this event had actually taken place was not so sure. Because for anything to happen, it has to happen at a certain date, and not at some other date, or even not at all. Also, the thing itself has to happen, and not by chance, something merely approximating it or something related. But this is precisely what no one can say of history, unless he happens to have written it down at the time, as the newspapers do. Or it's a matter of one's professional or financial affairs, since it is, of course, important to know how many years one has to go till retirement, or when one will come into a certain sum of money, or when one will have spent it, and in such a context, even wars can become memorable occurrences. Examined close up, our history looks rather vague and messy, like a morass only partially made safe for pedestrian traffic. Though oddly enough, in the end, there does seem to be a path across it. That very path of history of which nobody knows the starting point. This business of serving the stuff of history infuriated Ulrich. The luminous, swaying box in which he was riding seemed to be a machine in which several hundred kilos of people were being rattled around by way of being processed into the future. 100 years earlier, they had sat in a mail coach with the same look on their faces. And 100 years hence, whatever was going on, they would be sitting as new people in exactly the same way in their updated transport machines. He was revolted by this lethargic acceptance of changes and conditions, this helplessly contemporaneity, this mindless, submissive, truly demeaning stringing along with the centuries, just as if he were suddenly rebelling against the hat, curious enough in shape, that was sitting on his head. Instinctively, he got to his feet and made the rest of his way on foot. In the more generous human confines of the city in which he now found himself, his uneasiness gave way to good humour again. What a crazy notion of little Clarice's to want a year of the mind. He concentrated his attention on this point. What made it so senseless? One might just as well ask why Diotima's patriotic campaign was senseless. Answer number 1. Because world history undoubtedly comes into being like all the other stories. Authors can never think of anything new, and they all copy from each other. This is why all politicians study history instead of biology or whatever. So much for authors. Answer number 2. For the most part, however, history is made without authors. It evolves not from some inner center, but from the periphery, set in motion by trifling causes. It probably doesn't take nearly as much as one would think to turn Gothic man or the ancient Greek into modern civilized man. Human nature is as capable of cannibalism as it is of the critique of pure reason. The same convictions and qualities will serve to turn out either one, depending on circumstances, and very great external differences in the results correspond to very slight internal ones. Digression 1. Ulrich recalled a similar experience dating from his army days. The squadron rides in double file, and passing on orders is the drill. Each man in turn whispers the given order to the next man. So if the order given up front is Sergeant Major, move to the head of the column, it comes out the other end as 8 troopers to be shot at once, or something like that. And this is just how world history is made. Answer number 3. If, therefore, we were to transplant a generation of present-day Europeans at a tender age into the Egypt of 5000 BC, world history would begin afresh in the year 5000 BC, repeat itself for a while, and then, for reasons nobody could fathom, gradually begin to deviate from its established course. Digression 2. The law of world history, it now occurred to him, was none other than the fundamental principle of government in old Campania muddling through. Campania was an incredibly clever state. Digression 3, or answer number 4. The course of history was therefore not that of a billiard ball, which once it is hit takes a definite line, but resembles the movement of clouds or the path of a man sauntering through the streets, turned aside by a shadow here, a crowd there, an unusual architectural outcrop, until at last he arrives at a place he never knew or meant to go. Inherent in the course of history is a certain going off course. The present is always like the last house of a town, which somehow no longer counts as a house in town. Each generation wonders, who am I and what were my forebears? It would make more sense to ask, where am I, and to assume that one's predecessors were not different in kind, but merely in a different place. That would be a move in the right direction, he thought. He had been numbering his own answers in digressions as he went along, while glancing now into some passing face, now into a shop window to keep his thoughts from running away with him entirely, but had nevertheless gone slightly astray and had to stop for a moment to see where he was and find the best way home. Before taking this route, he tried once more to get his question straight in his mind. Crazy little Clarice was quite right in saying that we should make history, make it up, even though he had argued against it with her. But why didn't we? All that occurred to him in answer at that moment was Director Fischel of Lloyd's Bank, his friend Leo Fischel, with whom years ago he had sometimes sat outside a cafe in the summer. For if Ulrich had been talking to Fischel instead of himself, Fischel would typically have said, "I should only have your worries." Ulrich appreciated this refreshing answer Fischel would have given. "My dear Fischel," he immediately replied in his mind, "it's not that simple. When I say history, I mean, if you recall our life, and I did admit from the start that it's in very bad taste for me to ask, why don't people create history? That is, why do they attack history like so many beasts only when they are wounded, when in their shirt tails are on fire? In short, only in an emergency. So why is this question in such bad taste? What do we have against it, when all it means is that people shouldn't let their lives drift as they do?" "Everybody knows the answer," Director Fischel would retort. "We're lucky when the politicians and the clergy and the big shots with nothing to do and everybody else who runs around with all the answers keep their hands off our daily lives. Besides which, we're a civilized people. If only so many people nowadays weren't so uncivilized." And of course, Director Fischel was right. A man is lucky if he knows his way around stocks and bonds, and other people refrain from dabbling so much in history just because they think they know how it works. We couldn't live without ideas, God forbid, but we have to aim at a certain equilibrium among them, a balancing of power, an armed truce of ideas, so that none of the contending parties can get too much done. Fischel's sedative was civilization. It was the fundamental sentiment of civilization, in fact. And yet there is also the contrary sentiment asserting itself more and more, that the times of heroic political history made by chance and its champions have become largely obsolete and must be replaced by a planned solution to all problems, a solution in which all those concerned must participate. At this point, the Ulrich year came to an end with Ulrich's arrival on his own doorstep.